Hi everybody, on the screen is Kumiko, one of the teachers at Yoga Garden, and I'm Patrick. And today we're going to take our time, be a little bit technical, and really delve into the hips and how to work from the hips in your yoga practice. This is really important and it's one of the most common mistakes we see. For the purposes of today's video, I'll be doing everything wrong, thus the X, and Kumiko will be doing everything right. So let's get started. The foundation pose for all of this hip work is seated forward bend. In this pose, you're stretching out, elongating from the hips down to the toes. Now what happens is people get more caught up in the shape of the pose and are just trying to get their hands down there. But the point of this pose isn't to touch your toes, it's to stretch the backs of the legs. So right here, for example, I'm fumbling madly to get to my toes, but I'm forgetting to keep my feet strong and engaged like Kumiko is doing right here. When you concentrate more on the exterior shape of a pose rather than the interior workings, you often lose the intended stretch. So a casual glance at this pose, and you might think, that's not too bad. But if you actually take a close look at the details and look at the hips and ask yourself, are the hips working? You can see here that the pose moves, the hips don't move at all. Basically, I've done a really ineffectual and ugly back stretch. When we say working from the hips, we mean stretching out the back of the hamstrings, allowing the pelvis to tip forward like a hinge moving into the pose. This is going to increase the stretch and make it a proper stretch rather than an approximation of what the pose should look like. Sometimes I get the feeling that people don't understand why this is important. I mean, you're stretching, you're getting your hands down there, what's the big deal, right? Well, you can find the answer on probably your desk right now. If you go through your old pins and junk, you might find some rubber bands or some hair bands. So we're going to take two of these bands and try to understand what's happening in the backs of our legs. Let's say this left band is my upper leg muscles, my hamstrings, and this other right side is the lower calf and the heel socket. So of course these two leg muscles are connected via the knee, which I'll kind of simulate with this knot. Okay? So as the stretch is done properly, with the hips and pelvis tilting and working hard, you can see that top band is stretched because the pelvis connects to the hamstrings directly. As the hips move, the hamstrings move, kind of going along for the ride. Now let's take a look at the bottom. You can see I'm tilting my right hand, and that's adding some stretch to that lower band and a little bit to the top. And the same thing is happening when you engage your feet strongly. You're pulling down the calf muscles towards the heel. So you can see if we use both our right and left hands in this tilting action, you get a strong stretch through the band. The same is true of a proper forward bend. Working strongly from the hips and with active feet, you're going to get a deep pose. My feeling is if you've made the time to get to the mat, you might as well do a proper and effective stretch while you're there. So if you're not sure how much you're using your hips, your back is a dead giveaway. You can see here there's a big curve, kind of a humpback. This is because this pose was initiated from my back rather than my hips. If you're correctly using the pelvis and the hips, the back stays straight because the action is starting from deep in the base and doesn't have to go all the way up there. Even if you're not as flexible as Kumiko, you can keep your back straight, and that's going to make your pose much more effective and make you more flexible faster than just trying to hump over and touch the toes. The same is true for wide angle forward bend, which we talked a lot about in the Lotus video. I don't know why, but in this pose especially, people have a real need to get their hands far in front of them and their chest down. But the second you arch your back, you're going to lose 50 to 75% of the intended stretch of this pose. You might feel good that you've gotten far for that one class, but over the next 6 months or a year when you don't see much improvement, you'll be even more frustrated. So be patient, keep your back straight. Even if your hands are just going a little bit in front, that's okay. The same is true for any of the side variations of these poses. The action and power initiates from the hips, through the body, through the top of the head. And you can tell that the power started from the hips because the back is straight and not humping over. Let's get closer here. You can see that same pelvic hinge is in action, this time bending to the side and allowing the upper body to open and relax. This is much better than trying to contort over. This is going to be really hard to breathe in and you're not getting the best stretch. That leg is lifted off the mat and you're hardly getting anything in the groins, which is the point of the pose, right? Not to touch your toes. So next is triangle. This is the same idea. This time we're just standing. You can see the line of my back has a curve in it, which is an alarm bell that I'm not using my hips. Check out Kumiko's back here. The line is extremely straight the whole time, even as she goes deep into the pose. This means, by definition, that she's activated the pose from the hips. And we can check it right here as she goes back up. Watch the amount of movement out of the hips. Good. One more time. Watch the lines in her trousers as she goes deeper. That hinge action, that pivot, is where you get the best stretch in almost all of these leg poses. And checking the line again, yes, really straight back. Okay, so she's going to get a lot of stretch out of this pose, as opposed to someone just trying to get their hand down there on the floor. It's important to realize that almost all poses use the hips to a large extent. Even something like wheel, where you think of it as an arm and leg pose, is entirely based on the hip action. Right now, I'm not using my hips at all. My buttocks is relaxed, and it's a really flat table. But in Kumiko's version, she strongly engages the hips, lifting up and out of the pose, using that hinge to get a little bit of extra height, and her wheel takes on a graceful arch. So in your next class or your next practice, ask yourself, where are the hips in this pose, and how can I use them to maximize the stretch?